Welcome to the Africa Aspirations podcast, your go-to podcast for geopolitical issues of interest to Africans. Today we are joined from West Africa by investigative journalist David Hundeyin. Hello, David.
Hi, nice to meet you. Nice to be with you.
We also have your favorite political commentator, Levi Kabwato from Southern Africa. Hello, Levi.
Thanks, Lionel. I didn't know I was a fave, but I'll take it.
And also we have a special guest, Dr. Portia, lecturer in gender studies at the University of Botswana, a researcher and a consultant. Welcome, Doctor. Thank you to
Thank
join
you.
us.
Thanks for having
Uh,
me.
yeah, you're welcome. I'm hosting this show while we wait for our sister Fola Folayan to recover from a nasty flu. Today we're going to talk about elections in
Mm,
Botswana, Mozambique, and of course, the US. And my first question goes to you, Dr. Portia, as a gender
mm.
studies lecturer. Do the elections in Botswana reflect the aspirations of women? From your perspective, is the agenda being pushed by the president-elect in line with a progressive agenda?
Thanks for the question. I would like to say for now, I think it's too soon because he's yet to be sworn in and he's yet to really start, you know, hitting the ground and deciding on what needs to be done, his cabinet and all of that. But I think if I were just to look back, the previous administrations and all of that, yeah, the gender agenda is still not really where we want it to be in Botswana. First of all, we can just look at the number of women in parliament for a country that has been, 58 years, since independence, but we still have not even hit 50%, of women in parliament. So we're still really lagging behind. And this was basically across all political parties. And of course, what we see, in the cabinet, which is like, the deciding, body of the ruling party in parliament. I really think there's a lot that needs to be done. And I really hope that our president-elect Gideon, His Excellency Gideon Dumaboko, I mean, he's a lawyer. So I really think I'm hoping and I have the belief that we will going to start to, looking more into issues from, like he said, a human rights perspective, because that is extremely important. We haven't really done well historically in terms of, pushing, the gender agenda in terms of women, if I may put it that way. But of course, there are other issues also that needs his attention. If we look also at the landscape of Botswana right now in terms of, gender-based violence, it's extremely alarming. And we are really hoping that those kinds of agendas can be put forward and we can see action on the ground. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
on the same subject, we have also elections in Mozambique, and
Mm,
we are seeing, two different directions. In one case, in
mm,
Botswana,
mm,
the
mm,
transition seems to be going smoothly, and
mm,
in the other, results seem to be more controversial. We've had
right.
protests for a week now, I guess. So what do
Mm,
you think explains this difference? And I'm addressing these questions to all of you guys.
to all of us. Um, to be quite honest, I mean, I'm not quite conversant in the political landscape in Mozambique, but I'm pretty much aware of a bit of their history in terms of, the civil war, and then of course, the liberation war and stuff like that. But in terms of Botswana, the transition has been smooth. I think that can be attributed to a few number of things. We have always, I think, as a country, we've always had pride in the idea of, sitting down and talking issues like consensus, and transparency, and I think it's important to us as a nation, to ensure that things do not get out of control in that way. And I really think also at the end of the day, the voice of the people matters. If we say we're democracy as Botswana, we expect to see that being reflected, in our electoral processes in general. So I think that also played a huge role, really, in this transition that we saw, because at the end of the day, the people went to the polls, and the ballot spoke at the end of the day, and it had to be what it had to be. Where obviously the parties that have the upper hand in most of our countries, unfortunately, they tend to employ all kinds of tactics where, they just want to sway, the decisions their way. And of course, people are aware of these things, and it's frustrating. You want to see change.
Which is why it's very interesting that you talked about consensus building, a tradition of consensus building in Botswana. Levi, do you think that we would have thought that a country, a post-war country like Mozambique, would be, interested in consensus building? Why that hasn't been the case? Why do you think it hasn't been the case in Mozambique?
Yeah, thanks, Lionel, and thanks, Dr. Portia, and also congratulations on the remarkable election there, quite historic. So, Lionel, I think I'll just disagree a little bit with the framing of the question around consensus building in Mozambique. There actually has been a lot of effort, especially post the civil war, to bring together the fighting parties, largely the liberation movement, Frelimo, and what was the rebel movement, then became the official opposition in Renamo. So for the longest time, Mozambique has actually done tremendously well in terms of holding periodic elections, fairly free and fair, but these elections have consistently kept Frelimo in power. But what we are seeing is nothing new around the whole notion of the weariness that a lot of people, especially young people, are having with liberation movements across Southern Africa. So, Lionel, the short answer to the question is Frelimo actually did a very good thing ahead of these elections in that they had a very, I won't say transparent, but they had a fairly smooth transition of power internally as a political party, which then gave us a younger candidate, Chapo, and what you have in Mozambique right now reminds me of what happened in Malawi in 2019 when people basically said, we do not trust this process. We don't think it's a credible process, and therefore we're going to protest. So if Mozambique is anything like Malawi at this stage, what's happening is that you have all these young people, most of them, who are really fighting. So these are not like, for want of a better phrase, your well-to-do people, your, was it working class? No, it's, almost like the elites. It's not at this stage the elites. So what I was seeing from yesterday and a few days ago, you're beginning to have sort of like an elite consensus around questions of credibility. And what I'm hoping is going to happen next is now to bring people to the table and say, let's actually reflect on this process and let's find a way, the way that we found previously in sort of uniting Renamo and Frelimo in terms of let's have a shared agenda, let's have a common peace process that we can actually adhere to and have trust. So it's this trust that I fear the most, that if it's broken at this stage, after years and many years of trying to foster peace and sort of like consensus building between these two political parties, which are quite historical in Mozambique, I fear then that if that does not happen, then, not to be a prophet of doom, but I think it's really going to set Mozambique back by a mile. Lionel.
Oh, thank you very much. This is very interesting. I hope as well that the trust will be maintained. And my next question will be to David. I know he commented much on liberation movements versus what's emerging as oppositions in Africa. And
Mm,
what do you think, David? That the defeat of the ruling party in Botswana and what's happening in Mozambique, what happened before in Zimbabwe, and what happened also in South Africa signals a shift away from the liberation movements towards something more, I wouldn't say modern, but you know,
mm,
more in line with the current realities. David, what do you think?
So I think we've been seeing this shift for years actually. As you said, I made an extensive uh I, I, I believe it was on Twitter. I made an extensive comment about this where I linked the outcomes in the recent outcome in Botswana with that of the election in South Africa. Before that, the election in Zambia, and then the upcoming
mm,
elections in Namibia, where the ruling party there, which was also a liberation movement, SWAPO, is also in
mm,
trouble. And the point I was making was that across most of Southern Africa, the basic economic and political issue is the same, i.e., inequitable distribution of land. Land is the
mm,
single most important economic factor of production, and it's the single most important leverage for building wealth. So a population without land is a poor population. So the fact of the matter is that across Southern Africa, and maybe with the exception of places like Mozambique, which to the best of my knowledge, um, doesn't really have as much of a settler, issue as it once did. But for most of Southern Africa, certainly across English speaking Southern Africa, these problems are
mm,
basically intractable. So in a country like Namibia, for example, where I saw a statistic recently that completely blew my mind because of how much this has gone under the radar. Something like
mm,
74% of the country's land mass apparently is owned by non-resident Germans. So these are people who don't even they're not even white settlers. They're people who don't even live in Namibia anymore. Maybe their grandparents were settlers and they live
mm,
elsewhere. They still control land and make a living off of land that the actual Namibians do not have access to. And this is a tiny population of people. So this is a situation
mm,
across most of Southern Africa, and it really hasn't been dealt with. The only
mm,
country in Southern Africa that really made a significant attempt to deal with this thing, which was Zimbabwe, did so in a way that has, in the eyes of many people, has been thoroughly discredited now. So as a result of that, the idea in the minds of many young people across the region is that, well, the liberation movements exist to do one thing, which is to redistribute land. But if the cost of redistributing land is to become like Zimbabwe, is to use the ZANU-PF templates, then it's not worth it. Let's find another way.
mm,
That's kind of that that appears to be the way that young voters across the region are seeing things. It's actually at this point, it's up to the liberation movements to then show these voters why they should still be treated as though they have legitimacy, as though there is a need for them to exist. Because clearly, young people across the region no longer believe
mm,
that these liberation movements have a role to play. They think that these guys are irrelevant. These guys were suited to the world of 1956. But now that the liberation has been done, these guys don't know how to move a country forward. They don't know how to grow an economy. So the liberation movement needs to show young people across the SADC region that in addition to just sermonizing and putting out rhetoric about these issues, that they actually have solutions that are not ZANU-PF solutions, which nobody really wants across the region. So good luck to them.
What you're saying is very concerning because it seems that the people there are caught between a rock and a hard place.
Exactly.
You have people in Zimbabwe who feel like the liberation movement has failed that transition of redistribution. You will have a situation in South Africa where it's no longer about redistribution. We are uh, in alliance with people who don't want to talk about redistribution. Like the political coalition now with the DA, the Democratic Alliance, will not talk about redistribution. And we have also other countries where it seems that it's not even a subject. I don't know, Levi, you will tell us about your country. So what's the solution? What's the way forward? Like the parties that are coming, are they better? Like when you look at the opposition in Zimbabwe, when you look at the opposition in South Africa, uh, if we shift away from liberation movement, are we going in a better direction? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, maybe not necessarily a better direction, so to speak, but I think that space is very important. So David raises a very good example with the economic freedom fighters in South Africa as a political alternative to connect a movement to the liberation aspirations. So my take here, which is might be a very controversial take, but it's not so controversial. I still think that the whole notion around liberation movements is very important insofar as they exist to have presided over that whole transition from colonialism to to independence. And the PR problem that we have with liberation movements is that they have presided over the betrayal of those aspirations, and they have refused, a lot of them at the very least, to self-correct or to be corrected. So by limiting rights, closing space for other people, even non-governmental organizations to operate, for citizens to express themselves. So this is a huge challenge. But when you look at, maybe, say, a country with fairly strong institutions like South Africa, and you then raise an economic freedom fighters and the EFF, and this sort of like revolutionary rhetoric, its whole notion or posture as a Pan-Africanist movement, we're coming for the land, we need to have the land, then you see that message is not landing. You then have to ask yourself some serious questions. But you also have to understand the limitations that any other movement that comes and wants to deal decisively with the land question is going to face in Southern Africa at the very least. One is the problem of the constitution, right? So when we rethink, I think it was in one of the episodes when David was speaking about a total rewriting of the constitution. So this is what we would have to do, or what we would have to look into, to sort of either save, rethink, or reimagine what a liberation movement is. But it means then we have to also then think about the constitution and how we can change that, how we can reframe that aspiration to then connect and to then connect people to the land question, and then start dealing a lot more decisively with the issues of inequalities, economic progress, economic success, and so on and so forth. I know, lastly, you asked me about my country, Malawi. I don't even want to get started with sort of like how that question is landing there. But again, over the next 10 years, we're going to see a lot more of these contestations, right? Not just around the elections, but you're going to see a lot of pushback to the state, even on very little things, just around maybe your own movement and things like that, because a lot of people are looking for things to do. They're not getting the opportunities they need, and they feel, and rightly so, frustrated with the state of affairs.
Thank you. I was thinking maybe there are some good news from Botswana, and Dr. Portia was telling me that she wanted to celebrate the transition. Maybe she can tell us why this transition should be celebrated.
Yeah, I think I'll draw out from some of the points that both David and Levi have touched upon. Botswana also has a very interesting history in as far as um, quote unquote liberation movements are concerned. I think now we are in a space where we can say certain things without fear of backlash or intimidation. I think Levi might have said this earlier that Botswana could be a different story in terms of whether the BDP is a liberation movement, right? Essentially, it really is not, because it is a party that was formed actually to counter the more Pan-Africanist, I would have say, agenda in the young Botswana at that time, in the form of the Botswana People's Party, and it's there in the literature. And this was purely because the colonial apparatus wanted to safeguard its own interest in this country. So you talk about issues of land. We also have those issues here where you have huge chunks of land that are owned by, it's not so clear who owns these chunks of land in the country. And there's been these tensions between some tribes in Botswana, contestations about land, that this is actually tribal land. How is, this particular entity owning so much land in the country, right? So our history has also been interesting in that sense. We have good stories, but then we also have not so good stories that I really think sometimes they don't really get the attention that they deserve, right? I mean, all of you may know that Botswana has always been praised for so many things in Africa, in the region. Well, yeah, we did well in some of the things, but it doesn't negate the fact that right now we have huge gaps of inequality in the country, poverty in the country. This is a very small country, a diamond economy. And so how do we explain some of these things that we see, right? And I think right now where we are, I think you can sense the shift in the mood that, people really want change. People really want to have hope that something different, will come out of, these elections that we just got out of. And how do you explain hospitals right now failing, to provide basic, health care to the citizens? How do you explain, schools being in shambles right now? I mean, as an educator, we often go to schools across the country to do whatever we do, and you get shocked. Like, why are we here? So what really is the role of these liberation movements? So if we're not really seeing anything that speaks to a young Botswana, that, well, your talent, your expertise, and all of that are appreciated and they can be utilized within this economy, then you want change, you want something different, that's for sure. I was asking my students the other day, like, did you guys vote? They just clapped hands, they say they voted. So for me, I think there's really that thirst for change, and just to see what, reimagining Botswana under a very different administration entirely.
And we hope that the change you want will come. And I would like to turn to another election that it didn't take place in Africa, but it has consequences in Africa, I guess. I'm gonna ask David. Trump is back. Do you think this has any significance to Africa? Is this a consequential election for Africa?
It absolutely is so I'll stick to two reasons. I can think of 10 off the top of my head, but I'll stick to two of what I think are the most important reasons. The first one is that the emergence of Donald Trump as president has implications for, first of all, for Rwanda, where you come from, because as we've had this conversation before about how Rwanda was excluded from the American Growth and Opportunities Act as a result of the disagreement with the Trump administration back in, I think it was 2016, about when the Rwandan government basically said Rwanda aspires to um, incubate its own textile industry and doesn't want to basically be a dumping ground for used clothes from the US. As a result of that, Rwanda was excluded from the American Growth and Opportunities Act. The reemergence of Trump and the reemergence of the AGOA as an agenda, that raises a lot of questions now. So I thought it was very interesting that the Rwandan president was one of the first to tweet a congratulatory message to Donald Trump. I think there are going to be a lot of interesting conversations happening there because as you well know, Trump has a very mercantile economic policy outlook. He sees the world of economics with regard to the American relationship with the world as a zero-sum game where America has to win. So it's going to be very interesting to see how, particularly in Eastern Africa, where inclusion in the AGOA is a real economic issue, it's going to be interesting to see how people navigate or how governments navigate the reemergence of Trump. Because US foreign policy under Trump, with regard to the American Growth and Opportunities Act, traditionally had it that the the American end of the deal was we will give you some access to our market, but in return, this thing that we're going to, or this condition we're going to impose on you will probably make it difficult or impossible for you to incubate a certain type of industry or to industrialize a certain type of way. So that's definitely a problem that has reemerged. Now, the bigger issue, the second issue is that the exit of the Democratic Party from power and the entrance of Donald Trump specifically, not just any Republican, but Donald Trump specifically, has seismic implications in the world of diplomacy and foreign intelligence, which are sort of linked at the hip in the US. So, if you recall, during Trump's last tenure, the US State Department had its most turbulent period, I think, since Richard Nixon. There was a mass resignation within the State Department. The intelligence services do not like Donald Trump. The State Department does not like Donald Trump. The U.S. government, the U.S. Diplomatic and intelligence and even security establishment does not like Donald Trump, and he does not like them either. What then adds to that dynamic is that he believes that they have tried to kill him twice. Someone tried to kill him twice, obviously, during the campaign. We don't know who, but he believes that, it's the men in suits that did it. Whether that is true or not, we'll probably never know. But the point is, he has always had a vendetta, but now that vendetta is returning at a, like with it's being magnified to like times 10. Because in addition to the fact that he's coming with a grudge, they've dragged him through criminal courts. They put his face on a police mugshot. Um, he's, I believe, the first convicted felon to be elected president of the US. Um, he believes they've tried to kill him twice. There was the whole fallout from the January 16 in 2021, where he's portrayed as an insurrectionist. And then to top it all off, he has no re-election to look forward to. So he has no reason whatsoever to press brakes. So from day one, he's full throttle pedal to the metal. Already, people close to him, so people like Elon Musk have already been making noises about how from day one, what they refer to as the censorship complex within the US State Department is going to be defunded. Already, when people are making noises like that, you know there's going to be a huge civil war within the administration. What that means for Africa, and I analyzed this very in detail on my Twitter handle yesterday, what that means for us is that where there are certain countries on the continent, I mentioned a few, there are many more I could mention, but I specifically mentioned Nigeria and Kenya because those, to my eyes, are two of the most captured countries on the continent right now with regard to the American government's sort of overwhelming influence over their presidency and over their local politics. Countries like that have a 2 to 4 year window now because the State Department and the intelligence agencies and the civil service and whatever, they're going to be the Justice Department, they're going to be way too busy fighting Trump and fighting each other. We have a brief window now. If we're interested in such a thing, in such concepts as sovereignty and freedom, or whatever term used to describe it, we have a brief window now to purge these countries of this malign foreign influence. I use the word malign, right? And it's not as if foreign influence in and of itself is always a bad thing. I think every country has some measure of foreign influence active inside it. Where it becomes malign is where the interests of the countries that are exerting that influence and the interests of the countries that this influence has been exerted in do not match, but the will of the exerting country is triumphing in the country that is being exerted in. So, for example, in Kenya, where the Kenyan people have made it very clear multiple times that this new raft of laws and bills and regulations being pushed on them to the net effect of essentially overtaxing an already overtaxed population. People introducing bills to levy new taxes on chemotherapy treatments for cancer patients, for example. Whose idea was that? That idea did not come from Kenya. We know where that idea came from. And nobody in Kenya wants it, but you have this big 800-pound bully whose will is so powerful that it's getting bills passed in a country where nobody wants. People have died to stop this bill from passing. There was a whole nationwide movement, and they've just reintroduced the exact same bill once again. It's not William Ruto who is behind that. So where you have this big 800-pound bully, which historically has been able to cause this much damage and upheaval in other people's countries, and now potentially for the next 4 years, is going to be far too busy putting out its own internal fires and fighting itself. That gives these countries an opportunity to do something. I don't know what, but to do something to purge themselves of that malign influence and actually start acting sovereign. So in the case of Nigeria, for example, where it's pretty much the same playbook as Kenya, where these external interests have basically given instructions to the Nigerian government with regard to local economic and fiscal policy. So, devalue your naira. This wasn't a decision that was made by Nigerians, really. It was an instruction that was delivered to the Nigerian government to do it. Remove all fuel and energy subsidies. So basically, energy prices in Nigeria, which by the way is one of the world's largest energy exporters, energy prices in Nigeria are so expensive now that even accessing electricity, even if you can access electricity, it's almost like it's not worth it anymore because you can barely even afford it. Like ordinary middle class people are paying monthly electricity bills that are in the hundreds of dollars now, which makes no sense, right? A random middle class person in Nigeria, where the per capita income is $1,600 per annum, is paying the same for energy that a middle class person in Birmingham or New York is paying. How does that make sense? And Nigeria is an energy exporter. But I am saying that there is a window now for African countries to start acting in ways that actually assert their own sovereignty.
Yes, that's very interesting. Levy, it's interesting that David alluded to the reaction of President Kagame. And President Kagame said something very, very important, I think, during that message. He said, basically, I'm paraphrasing, he suggested that, America should lead by, the force or the attraction of its example rather than force people to adopt its way of life. I thought it was very interesting. Levi, what did you think about that?
Trump being back is no surprise at all. I'd like to just touch on two things as well. I mean, there's a lot that could be said about his return. The window of opportunity that David is talking about arises by the fact that Trump has always been an inward-looking president, or is an inward-looking person. So this is a great thing for anybody who's not in the United States. Trump being inward-looking means we in Africa are not at the center of the US attention. And again, that is a really good thing that we need to look deeply into and see how much we can exploit that. So if he behaves anything like the first term, where he's going to ask NATO to do its part in terms of the financial contributions, he's going to look at the aid from the United States and how it's distributed globally, and what can be done to bring some of those resources back into the US, because his agenda, if you look at maybe the mass deportation that they've been talking about, and you better believe them when they say that's what they're going to do. So that agenda is going to require a lot of funding to execute. If that funding is going to have to come from somewhere, they're not going to print more money. They're going to find the resources that they have, resources that would have been allocated to, just maybe, donor aid through, other agencies of the government and things like that. So that money leaving the continent and leaving other places in the global south is necessarily going to be a good thing. Yes, it's going to be painful for certain organizations or groups or people that have long benefited from this, but it begins to detangle our countries from US influence. And the more Trump looks inwards, the more the space opens up for other countries and for the continent like Africa to be a bit more decisive, to be a bit more selfish with our aspirations, and begin to really ask ourselves, what can we do in this moment to redirect the course of our country? So obviously, there's going to be resistance, right? There are people who have an outlook that fundamentally obviously wants to keep America as the policeman of the world. They want to maintain American hegemony. So all these things like AGOA, for example, they're going to be used as instruments to keep or to whip rather other countries in line. They're going to be used as threats, so you can no longer do this, or we will do this to you. So we have to find leaders, or we have to see leaders who have a backbone, leaders who are able to stand up and say, this is what we believe in, this is what we're going to do. So, I mean, that whole sentiment from President Kagame, I think it's a lot welcome to then say, how do we work together as equals, not as, having a bully presiding over something and basically dictating what should happen in what is otherwise a sovereign country. Lionel?
Thank you. Speaking of disruption, and this will be my last question. Trump said he's not going to start new wars. He's gonna stop wars. Do you actually believe that
I
in
believe it.
the current context of intense competition with Russia, China, and other emerging powers in the Middle East, do you actually believe that?
I believe him. I
So
believe him. I think Trump is he's going to run that he runs that country as if it's a business, right? And that's fundamentally his instinct, and it's a good instinct. And I know a lot of people who are worried about Trump, worried because of the losses in privilege, the losses in power that comes with having a person like that who's not traditionally or naturally a war hawk or a warmonger, for example. So those things don't make sense to a person like that, and he cannot hide it. So when David speaks about, the internal fights that are going to happen, whether at the State Department, whether within the intelligence circles, is because Trump really is not capable of playing that game. He's not a person who can play that game because he's not that type of a person, or he's not that type of a politician. So I actually believe that. In terms of, obviously, he would want to say, well, make America great again means we have to have the best capabilities. He said as much. He's going to invest more in the security apparatus. But in terms of then saying, let's actually go to war, I highly doubt, unless other people that is going to bring into the administration are going to force him to do that. But I don't believe that we will see any new significant wars. We might have a protracted, solution to the war in Gaza, the war in Ukraine, for example. Maybe those things might take a bit of time to wind down. But in terms of new wars starting, I highly doubt that this is going to happen, at the very least in the next 4 years.
David,
I,
this is a
I
president who said we are in Syria for the oil. This is also a president who sold to Ukraine weapons that even Obama was reluctant to sell to Ukraine. So in some way, he increased tensions in that region. Uh, do you also believe that this is a president who's gonna come and maybe there are some conflicts that are already happening and he's not going to uh, still conflicts or, support one side against the other. This is also a president who threatened to invade Venezuela at some point. So, do you believe what he said?
So when analyzing Trump, I think the most the most useful thing to do is to look at what he has done, not what he might do or what he has said he would do, what he actually has done. Because I think those are the only data points that you can use to make a reasonable projection about what he's actually likely to do. And the fact remains that during his 4 years in office, there was a lot of bombast and there was a lot of, brinkmanship, referring to Kim Jong-un as Rocket Man and authorizing the drone strike on General Soleimani, the Iranian general, which you could say definitely was an act of war. So there were such things. But by and large, you would have to say that compared to what came before him and what came after him, I mean, what came before him, you can look. So the two presidents before him, George Bush and Barack Obama, you can literally pin a certain new
Absolutely.
wars on each one. And the president that came after him, the same thing with Ukraine and with Palestine, really. In Trump's 4 years, there was a lot of talk, there was a lot of bombast, and there was a lot of, selling weapons to all sorts of people and doing all sorts of dodgy, he is a dodgy businessman at the end of the day, his personal history. But the truth is, it really didn't go beyond that. Trump simply doesn't strike me as a wartime sort of, or let me rephrase that. Trump doesn't strike me as someone who actively desires to go to war, which is not to say that he's a good person or that he's anti-war. I don't think that either. But he just doesn't strike me as a person who wants to nail that to his mast. That he wants that to be the hill that he dies on, right? Compared to what came before him and what came after him, that just seems to be the reality. Between 2016 and 2020, the US started no new wars. And in fact, it's sort of covert influence in multiple regions around actually suffered because of the amount of fires he started within the State Department and the intelligence and security apparatus. So if this upcoming term is anything like his first term, I think it's fair to say that this will not be a period in time where the world is going to become a significantly more dangerous place, which can only be a good thing. Again, this is not to say that Donald Trump is a good person. He's not. You generally don't tend to become president of the United States by being a good person. That's just the reality. We all know, the multiple issues that exist in his personal history as a business person and some of the stuff he has even done in politics. We know. But at the end of the day, when you are facing a situation where you have to constantly choose between the lesser of two evils, he definitely is the lesser of both evils that were on offer during the US election. And I see opportunities. So from a strictly African point of view, I'm thinking of the AES region, that's the Alliance of Sahelian States. And they definitely woke up yesterday feeling good about the world and feeling good about their prospects in the short to medium term. Because having a president that is not, even from his body language, from the things he says, you can clearly see that he sees US military sprawl not as power projection, but as a burden on the US taxpayer. This is why he makes noises about NATO partners paying for this and paying for that. That is good news from an African point of view because it means that this is not the president who wants to authorize new military expansion, into Africa maybe to reestablish a presence in those countries that the US military has been asked to leave. That's good news, right? So it means that these countries potentially have 4 years to consolidate the gains that they've made, to strengthen their militaries even further, to strengthen their confederation and their economic ties to each other. After which point, probably it becomes a lot more difficult to destabilize them, which from an African point of view can only be a good thing. So to be honest, I see a lot of upside, which is not to say that there's no downside. but I see a lot of upside. I see definitely much more upside than downside.
Okay, so I guess we're gonna end on this optimistic note. Thank you guys for being with us. It's always a pleasure to have you, and I hope our listeners will enjoy this program. And we remind everyone to subscribe if you like our content. And this is where we end our podcast today. Take care and see you next week.
Bye, everyone.